Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good night. My name is Vitor Silva. I'm from the Global Earthquake Model, and I guess this is probably the first presentation which will be a little bit more technical than the previous ones. So I work at the Global Earthquake Model, which is a not-for-profit organization with a mandate to communicate and calculate earthquake risk worldwide. In terms of the assessment of the impact from earthquakes, we follow more or less the same approach as has been explained for the perils in this webinar. So the assessment of the impact from earthquake requires a combination of different components. If we start from the bottom of this image, we have the main three ingredients. We have the seismic hazard, which can be defined as the probability of exceeding a ground motion level at a particular site and within a specific interval of time. We have exposure, which defines the spatial distribution, the value, the vulnerability classes of the elements exposed to the seismic hazard, and the physical vulnerability, which is basically the probability distribution of damage or loss ratio conditional on the given ground motion level. So the combination of these three components allows estimating seismic risk, which can be defined as the probability of damage or loss to people and structures due to earthquakes. And I would like also to call your attention that it is possible to include, obviously, the socioeconomic vulnerability of the affected region in order to account for the possible aggravation or attenuation of the impact of earthquakes due to socioeconomic conditions. For instance, during this web seminar, we heard about the fact that during the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the fact that the preparedness of the Japanese government was very good, he allowed to minimize the impact of the earthquake. So these components are further explored in this presentation. So if we just start by the observation of the global seismicity, the global distribution of earthquakes shown in this figure is one of the key insights into the shape of the Earth's lithospheric plates and also their direction of movement. The vast majority of earthquakes are generated at boundaries, where plates converge, diverge, or move laterally past one another. And the greatest proportion of seismicity occurs in regions where lithospheric plates converge with one another. These convergent boundaries may manifest in regions of subduction, where oceanic crust is forced down beneath either the continental plate or oceanic crust. This is the west of South America or the coast of Japan, where we have subduction regions. Convergent boundaries may also produce regions of continental collision, resulting in tectonic compression, such as, for instance, the Himalaya, in which we saw a few years ago the bigger earthquake in Nepal. Both types of regional environments are characterized by regions of high seismic activity and host faults capable of generating very large earthquakes. In this image, we see the global distribution of earthquakes, a general distribution also of different active faults, and we can see that earthquakes can happen at very different depths. So the recording and archival of seismic events throughout history is fundamental for our understanding of the earthquake process. For instance, if we focus on historical events, from the early civilizations until the advent of the era of instrumental recording, the descriptions of earthquakes can be found in many historical sources. For example, reports of earthquakes began to emerge from the Mediterranean region, the Middle East, China, and Japan from the 5th century before Christ. For example, notable earthquakes is clearly in early civilizations include the Sparta event in Greece, which was well known for the destruction of the statue of the Colossus of Rhodes. Several other events and damage reports with hundreds of years can be found also worldwide. However, more recently, we have the modern era of instrumental seismology that started in the early 1960s, with the establishment of the worldwide network of seismograph stations, which deployed over 120 continuously recording stations. The International Seismologic Center maintains the most comprehensive bulletin of seismic events since 1964. The ISC bulletin defines the location and size of earthquakes from an integrated network of approximately 14,500 seismic stations, as presented in this figure. If we move something to maybe a little bit more practical now, and I'm already showing some examples here for Colombia, so a map of active faults, an earthquake catalog, and finally the resulting seismic hazard. So the quality of these input data sets usually dictates the choice of methodology for seismic hazard assessments. Consequently, seismic hazard might be analyzed in two main ways. Either either deterministically, in which a single earthquake scenario is identified, or probabilistically, in which all potential earthquake scenarios are explicitly considered, along with their likelihood of occurrence. Deterministic approaches may be perceived as simpler and more conservative, as often we seek just the worst-case scenario that can happen in a region. The probabilistic approach requires complex formulations to account for uncertainties in earthquake size, location, and time of occurrence. This approach allows estimating seismic hazard maps, such as the one that is being presented here, which provide expected ground shaking for a pre-established probability of exceedance within a time span. For instance, this is the shaking for Colombia for 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years, which is equivalent to the commonly used 475 years return period. This method, for instance, used in seismic regulations, which is one of the most efficient measures to reduce the risk from earthquakes. Now, if we move to the impact, so as previously mentioned, this assessment requires not just a seismic input, but also an exposure model and a set of fragility or vulnerability functions. Exposure models can be created through many different approaches, such as field missions to collect building-by-building information, national housing census, cadastral data, socioeconomic data, satellite imagery, amongst many other approaches. And we saw a very comprehensive presentation by Martin Wolf from Geoscience Australia in this seminar about the importance of geospatial data. On the other hand, fragility and vulnerability functions can be derived using also two main approaches. So the first relies on damage or loss data to perform regression analysis to derive basically probabilistic models that establish a relation between the probability of damage or fractions of loss and a given intensity measure. So this is done using loss data or damage data from past events. For the regions in the world where we don't have such data, we can also use numerical models to simulate the response of the built environment when subjected to increasing levels of shaking. The analytical results can then be used to derive fragility or vulnerability models, as also explained for the empirical approach with empirical data. Once the exposure and vulnerability models are available, it is possible to estimate expected damage or loss due to single events, as presented in this figure. In this case, this is just a simple example for the capital of Colombia, Bogota. We have an event of magnitude 6.3. We have the mean ground shaking around the city. We have the associated number of collapses and also the economic losses expressed in millions of US dollars. So in this particular case, I'm showing an impact only for a single event around the capital city of Colombia. On this example, I have seismic risk assessment in which I'm considering all the possible events that might happen in Colombia, obviously with the associated likelihood of occurrence. In this case, a probabilistic seismic hazard model is necessary, as explained before. Once again, exposure and vulnerability models are employed, and probabilistic risk metrics can be calculated. These probabilistic risk metrics can include, for instance, probable maximum losses, which define the expected loss for a particular level of frequency or return period, or generalized average losses, which define how much a country, a region, or an asset is expected to lose on average, and normalized by a one-year span. For instance, in this particular case, I'm showing generalized losses for the second administrative level in Colombia, is the map in the middle. And I would like also to highlight that this average annual losses can be, for instance, aggravated or attenuated based on the social vulnerability, which is the last map that I'm showing on the right, which is a vulnerability index which takes into account the socioeconomic fabric, like, for instance, crime, unemployment, education, number of hospital beds, amongst other indicators. This is my last slide. I would like just to call the attention for seismic risk reduction measures, which is basically the final step in this process. In seismic risk reduction strategies, this offers very considerably depending on the resources of the country or region, the capacity, level of seismic risk, and the period of time. Basically, if we are aiming for short-term or long-term interventions. For instance, this is just a list of some of the most common strategies for the development of seismic risk awareness campaigns, like, for instance, doing some simulations in schools and also with the community in general. The enforcement of seismic design regulation, which is probably one of the most efficient ways to reduce earthquake risk. Development of post-disaster emergency response plans, like for instance the ones that exist in Japan, in many other parts of the world, which help people to respond more efficiently to disasters. Development of seismic retrofitting campaigns. I believe, for instance, Saha mentioned how retrofitting schools can reduce consistently the risk. Improvement of urban planning, so taking into account what is, for instance, the shaking that people should be designing, or making sure that people are not building in places which are more prone to ground shaking or, for instance, secondary effects. And the creations of insurance pools to transfer the risk from the public sector to the international insurance market. Some very good examples of this is in New Zealand or for instance, in Turkey, in which it's no longer the public sector that is that has the burden of the recovery. I would like just to thank UNSDR for the opportunity to collaborate on these initiatives, and also thank the hundreds of experts that have been contributing and working with them in the last 10 years.